This video will tell you how to apply gold leaf to very small things.
Gold leaf, I think, is a really lovely material, and I haven't seen it much in the modelling community. There have been a few pictures here and there, but I think if applied correctly, it can make a miniature really stand out. One of the lovely things with gold leaf is that it reflects true, just like normal metal would do, other than gold paint, which only reflects to a certain degree. So let's go with the tools of what you'll need in order to do this. You're going to need some paint brushes. A stiff brush and a relatively soft brush is a good combination. Not very large, not very small. You're also going to need a much larger brush that has a nice combination of stiffness but also has quite a soft bristle touch. This is going to be used to brush off the excess gold leaf later. One of the other things that I'm using in this instance is a very fine wet and dry sandpaper to rough up the surfaces just slightly to help the glue dry a little nicer. This is the glue in question. When gold leafing, you use a glue called Size. Now it's a water-based, in this instance, glue. It's white and PVA glue-esque in appearance, and it dries tacky. Now, one of the key things that I found is that when you want to paint with gold leaf on small things such as this, you're not going to really remember where you've glued because it dries clear. So I find adding a colour, in this instance I've used Tausept Ochre, you can mix that together with the glue to make it easy to see. Now you're going to need water and of course the gold leaf. I'm using here, this is relatively cheap imitation gold leaf, it's very inexpensive. You get about 500 sheets in the UK for about £5. This stuff's very malleable, but it will tear if too much pressure is applied. Talking in front of it is enough to make it blow away in the wind. Now this was a slightly more expensive kind of gold leaf. It was the same price, but you got about 10 times less amount of sheets. And the sheets were smaller as well. The difference is, I think, in this one is that the gold is slightly deeper, a little more lustrous. However, the metal sheet it behaves differently. It's almost like a thin film of, I know it sounds strange, but like a thin film of metal rather than some kind of foil, whereas that breaks and splits over the other one, which does bend a little more. And of course you're going to need a subject. I'm using a beaky style helmet from the Warhammer 40k range. I'm also just going to use a flat surface. This is just a rhino door panel or predator door panel, but I'm just going to use this flat surface to demonstrate the irregularities in the brushwork. And then something a little more organic, something a bit more interesting, I'm using a bone sword from a Tyranid Hive Tyrant, which is originally made of metal. So again, super simple process. So you're going to want to use the wet and dry sandpaper just to rough up some of the edges slightly. You're going to want to get rid of any mould lines, because one thing that the gold leaf will do is it'll accentuate every single imperfection on the surface, much like airbrushing. So if the surface is the slightest bit defected, has the smallest little wrinkle in it or line, the gold leaf will highlight that massively because it's reflective, so it will cause that surface to have a very reflective edge and it will catch your eye. So I'm using this just to get rid of the mould line and to also smooth out a little bit of the profile. I'm also using this on this large panel surface just to smooth it down, even it up, to try and give myself the best flat surface as possible. This surface has already been painted, so it's not going to be perfectly smooth anyway. But I'm going over it anyway just to help the paint, to help the glue, stick a little nicer to the material. Right, so let's start with some of this size. Just want to place a little blob down somewhere. I don't mind putting it on my paint. I don't mind putting it on my cutting mat because I can wipe it away later. A little goes a long way with this stuff, so you don't need to use all that much. And we're going to be mixing some of it with this orangey coloured paint. Just a small amount of water will do as well, just to help activate the paint and to mix it a little nicer with the acrylic based size. You can get other kinds of sizes. I think you can make your own when you're doing traditional gold painting, which is oil based or resin or rosin perhaps. But for small hobbyist uses, and especially with miniature painting, it's a lot easier to just stick with a water-based size. Now I didn't quite have enough and I used a bit too much paint, so I was just adding a little bit more of this size into the mix. just to make it a little more adhesive. So you want to give it a good thorough mix. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to paint in one direction on this surface, trying to keep my brush strokes not necessarily to a minimum, but the force of the brush strokes to a minimum. I want to have the flattest surface I can possibly get. Now it's a little different than paint. Even though there's paint mixed into it, this is very much a glue, so it almost dries immediately when you put it onto a surface. To some degree, you will end up seeing some brush marks, and you can try and mitigate this by going over with a softer or a lighter brush, or with slightly more water. But as you can see from the reflections, you can see that the brush lines are still there. Now I'm going against the brush line grain originally to try and minimize this, but even now, and I've only had the paint and the glue on there for several seconds, it's starting to dry up on this surface, and I'm struggling to consistently cause the grain of my brush strokes to move in one direction. You can see it's quite, it almost has like a wood grain appearance to it. I suppose that could be a desirable effect if that's what you're going for. Now here I'm going to try on the smaller item. Because there are so many angles and details, it's much less important to keep consistency in one direction down, so you can paint this much like you would paint it if you were painting with some kind of priming colour. When the size dries, it will shrink slightly because the water in the acrylic based glue and also the water in the acrylic based paint will evaporate away, so you will retain some of the details even if initially it looks like you've lost them because the glue has clogged up the surface. But I'm just going to thoroughly paint over this piece. And again, you don't really want to work in very large areas at a time. I would say that large panel I did previously was probably the largest size you'd want to work at in one session, because if you work much larger, unless you're using a larger brush of course, but if you work much larger then the paint can dry up on you. So this bone sword, each side of this bone sword is about the same surface area as that flat panel, but it's obviously double-sided, so it's not quite a connected piece. Again, I'm trying to keep the paint stroke direction relatively soft and light, just so I can produce a unique and relatively uniform appearance, because the gold leaf, as I've mentioned before, picks up every single imperfection. I think gold leaf has its strengths and weaknesses, and I think from my experience thus far that it works better on flat, large surfaces, or at least larger, simpler surfaces, because the gold reflects much more like a mirror, and it has there's something familiar about a larger reflective surface than something with incredibly high definition of detail. Okay, so we need to leave it to dry now, and the drying time for this acrylic size on this scale at this thickness of the amount of paint that we applied was probably about 5 minutes, although here I've only left it for about 2 minutes, and you can see that sort of wood grain effect is still quite apparent on that surface. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a certain part of my skin, in this case a knuckle, because it's still sensitive enough because it's on my hand, but it's not a fingerprint, because fingerprints to humans are very easily recognizable, so if there are lots of knuckle prints on it you're probably not going to notice, but if there's a fingerprint you'll pick it out quite easily. And it's leaving a very slight mark touching against the surface. The surface will be tacky and sticky, so it was just a little too wet, so I'm just going to leave it to dry a little longer. This was about 5 minutes by this time, and I know I'm using my fingertip here, but the glue has dried enough. As you can hear, that tacky noise, that's the noise we're looking for. sticky. That consistency of tackiness is when you know that the surface is ready, and I think this acrylic glue this acrylic size will have that tacky behaviour to it for quite a while before it dries up completely. So we're going to use this inexpensive gold leaf first. I'm finding this particular gold leaf to be a little more successful because it's more flexible. So quite simply, you just lie it on top of the surface of what you've done. And I'm going to take my large soft brush and very gently press the gold leaf against that surface, allowing the material to conform to all the edges. And I'm going to stipple the brush down. This is going to help press some of those air bubbles out and some of those cracks out. Now using a gentle swirling motion, this will also help flatten out some of those cracks and crevices. Now brushing uniformly in a single direction. This is going with the grain of the brush strokes previously. Now this is why having a brush that's very soft but also quite stiff comes in handy, because even though you can tear it with your fingers quite easily to remove it, you're definitely not going to peel this off. Once it's on there, so don't worry too much. But you will end up with lots of this flash. It does have a name and I've forgotten it, unfortunately, but you can use the brush in this instance to peel away all this excess material. You can be quite aggressive with it and quite vigorous. You will have to be quite consistent to get rid of all of this excess material, and you'll want to do it, otherwise it'll make a big mess all over the floor or all over the gaming table or wherever these models are going to be. You want to make sure that you've got rid of as much of it as possible. And lightly dusting the front and the surface as well is going to help burnish out some of those air bubbles. So here we go, I'm trying to focus in now. Here we go. And you can see quite how reflective that surface is. It's pretty much a mirror now. It's a yellow mirror. You can very easily see my fingernails in the reflection of the surface, and that's all we did, was apply one sheet. You could of course go over this again with another sheet. That will get rid of any holes that have been made from the cracking of the gold leaf foil that you've placed in. You can softly burnish it with other materials if you want to, but the best thing now is to just leave it to dry. Now here I was going to use, I think I was going to use the more expensive gold leaf, but some of the inexpensive gold leaf fell onto it during that process, so I was just going to stick with this for now. And this is with something a little more complicated, but what you can do is easily peel off any of the excess material with your fingers and lightly press it down into any of the exposed areas of size. Because we used that paint before, we can see any exposed areas that have not been covered in gold leaf. You could of course use any other colour if you wanted to have something that was easier to spot. I chose yellow because any of the areas where the gold leaf won't be covering, the underneath will be yellow, so it's not too different a colour from the gold leaf anyway. You can see there was a couple shots there where the gold leaf was actually transparent because it's such a thin sheet of metal that you can't actually see through it. And because of the shape and size of this material, I was mostly using my fingers for this work. You don't have to be pretty or fancy about it. The only job really is to get the gold leaf to stick onto every surface. And again, I'm using that soft yet firm brush to help press out any of the air bubbles and work away all that excess flash of the gold leaf. It does have a particular name, and I would have put a bubble up by now as to what the name of that material is. One of the nice things with doing this process as well is that there will be some areas that weren't covered with the film of gold leaf, and brushing it backwards and forwards will cause tiny flecks to fall off, but then they will subsequently land onto those glued surfaces that you missed previously, helping covering up any of the small areas that you missed. I'm here sort of quite firmly. I'm using my fingers here as well. And again, we have a practical mirror. You know, this was the inexpensive gold leaf as well. They do have slightly differing levels of luster and colour. In this instance, I'm going to be using the more expensive gold leaf, just to trial it out, seeing as this could be, you know, signified as a sergeant or a captain or a special character. You'd want to use something a little more ostentatious, I suppose. But as mentioned before, this gold leaf behaves slightly differently than the previous one. This one, as you can see, is rolling up and coiling. It's much like a firm sheet of paper in that it tears and snaps, whereas the other one was much like a piece of foil where it kind of bends and breaks. This has a very uniform breaking pattern. I don't know if that's because of the concentrations of alloys used or the percentage of gold. Again, it's quite simple. You just lie it on the surface and gently press away. I'm going to use this smaller brush purely because you want to use an appropriate sized brush with the level of detail you're using. If you use a larger brush, what you can end up doing is pushing away chunks of gold leaf away from those nooks and crannies and those details and crevices, and what that can end up doing is causing splitting and cracking, and you'll end up seeing the previous layer of glue underneath it, and it can give you quite an inconsistent surface detail. Again, obviously, if there's pieces that are broken off, you can simply pick them up again, place them back on top, and apply it onto any area where you can see anything exposed. You can see on my fingertips already that this gold leaf splits and fractures and is making quite a big mess. So I'm switching to a much finer brush now to push the gold leaf really tightly into all of those details, because this is a very detailed piece. All behind the rivets on the brow, into the eye sockets, and there's some small, almost like whiskers, like grates and little holes on the beak itself. It's a combination of stippling, pressing inwards, and circling around as like a burnishing technique. And what would traditionally be used on gold leaf when painting on picture frames or doing ornate items in the sort of in the art world and in the historical world, a very soft stone of agate would be used to burnish once the size has fully cured and the gold leaf is rested perfectly upon it. A stone would be used to press the surface smooth, giving the gold leaf a perfect mirror finish. However, it's very tricky to do that on something so small with so many details that if you push too hard, even after the size has cured, you can end up pulling the gold leaf off and cracking it. So I think the best way to get gold leaf to sit on a surface like this is to get it right the first time. I'm using the static properties of the brush to lift up some of the smaller bits of gold leaf, and now switching to the larger brush to brush away all the excess material. And you can see the reflectivity of the brush flashing against this helmet as I'm swirling it around. And one thing to note is that the camera, funnily enough, picks up so much detail that it can see cracks and it can see imperfections in the gold leaf better than the human eye can. And the colour correction settings or something, I did have a little play around, makes the gold leaf not actually look all that gold. Honestly, to anyone who's seen obviously real gold items or even gold leaf items in real life, the experience of seeing it is different than seeing it on a screen. There is a warmth, there is a beauty, a luster that just can't be replicated. Again, there are some small flecks that haven't come off yet, but you can come back to it later and more aggressively brush the surface to remove some of that gold leaf. But it's quite a messy process. You can see here I've got gold leaf all over the floor. So there we are. We have a large flat surface and we have the helmet. I really tried my best to film this, but honestly it's very tricky to get something that looks so beautiful in real life to look just as beautiful in a photograph. There we go. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Obviously, any questions, please ask away, and thank you for your time.